my knowledge of wars and genocide, different wars and genocides, basically give me this feeling of I felt really threatened, and my very first idea was to flee Ukraine. So, but at that time, two of my sisters were expecting babies, so I waited several days, and both of them gave birth to wonderful baby boys. And after those couple days, I took my 9-year-old son and I fled Ukraine.
Over the last few years, there have been so many videos on YouTube about the Ukraine war, the geopolitics of the Ukraine war, the military situation of the Ukraine war. But the interview I'm going to bring you today with Ukrainian historian Marta Havryshko is really something different, and I think something very special. Whatever your perspective on the events on the war in Ukraine, she is an historian, a witness to events in Ukraine, a refugee from the war in Ukraine. More than that, she is a scholar of the Holocaust, a scholar of anti-Semitism, Eastern European history of sexual violence, memory politics, and the violent far-right ethno-nationalism that has taken a hold in Ukraine in the last decade. Marta, thank you for joining me. I'm so grateful you have joined the Burning Archive for this discussion of what's going on in Ukraine.
Thank you for having me, and thank you so much for the invitation.
You're welcome. I want to ask you about how the war's affecting people in Ukraine, I guess, primarily, rather than, causes and battle situations and all that sort of thing. And also talk about your work that highlights, I guess, ethno-nationalism in Ukraine, far-right nationalism in Ukraine, and especially what's going on with forced mobilization at the moment. But I thought maybe as a start, could you maybe just tell us what happened to you at the start of this war? Because you're a historian, and so I understand that you were on your way to work at the Babyn Yar sort of museum in Kiev. And what happened then?
Thank you so much for your question. Actually, I remember this, the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine very well, because it was a turning point in my life. I just came from Munich, where I held temporal research position at the Center for Holocaust Studies, where I was working on my book on Holocaust in Ukraine. So I came to Ukraine, and I was prepared to move to Kyiv to occupy a new position, Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, where I was appointed as director of one of the research institute. I had so many plans, so big plans, educational plans, academic plans. I planned to develop educational programs on Holocaust at Ukrainian universities. I planned book series and book presentations and talks about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, for example. But everything was basically canceled in one night when Putin started his angry speech. And from the very beginning of this speech, I realized that this is big war. And actually, in one night, all plans were canceled. And as a historian of World War II and the Holocaust, the first thoughts that came to my mind were the thoughts similar to the thoughts of Ukrainian Jewish women who experienced this German attack at Soviet Union on 22 June 1941, and many of them started to think what to do. And the main question was what to do, how to protect family members, how to protect your children, what to do basically, leave, flee, or stay and resist, and hope that everything will be okay. But my personal experience, my background, my knowledge of wars and genocide, different wars and genocides, basically give me this feeling of I felt really threatened, and my very first idea was to flee Ukraine. So, but at that time, two of my sisters were expecting babies, so I waited several days, and both of them gave birth to wonderful baby boys. And after those couple days, I took my 9-year-old son and I fled Ukraine. I fled Ukraine through Poland. Then I spent some time at Hamburg at the research institute where I used to work temporarily some time ago. And then I became a research fellow at the Basel University. And basically, I taught their course. A course about war in Ukraine and gender aspects of war in Ukraine, and that then I got a generous proposal from Clark University, where I'm basically now almost 2 years, and here I teach courses on anti-Semitism, racism, on Eastern Europe, and sexual violence in war and genocide, including Holocaust. And I'm still working on my book on sexual violence during the Holocaust in Ukraine. But my other side project is related to Ukraine, to current Russia-Ukraine war, to gender aspects of this war, and also I'm studying development of current far-right movement in Ukraine, ethnic nationalism in Ukraine. Why? Because it's heavily rely on the legacy of the Ukrainian nationalist movement from the World War II. They used most iconic members of current far-right movement, like Azov movement, for example, right, like Pravy sector, like Svoboda party. They rely heavily on the works of nationalist ideologists like Dontsov, Mikhnovsky, Lepinsky, and other, and they celebrate Stepan Bandera, Roman Shukhevich, and other very problematic figures. And they celebrate them as freedom fighters. And later, maybe I will discuss more on this issue, because it's not only those problematic figures are not only celebrated in some marginal far-right groups, but on the very state national level. They became an integral part of this national myth that is now is instrumentalized for war efforts to mobilize society for the war against Russia. Because as we know, the main enemy of the Ukrainian nationalist underground movement was Russia, was communist Russia and USSR. That's why Ukraine state and Ukraine memory actors made this very clear link between the Second World War and between current event and current Ukraine resistance to Russian aggression.
Wow, I mean, you can sense there that you're a historian, you're witness, you're refugee. Like, as I
Yeah,
understand it, there's
yeah,
like more than 7 million Ukrainian refugees
yes.
since February 2022. But you're also sort of reporting, I guess, on current events as well through your X account, which there'll be links to below. But you've also been back. You still have friends, family, professional connections, and you visited Ukraine in recent times. I wonder, before we go into the specifics of, ethno-nationalism and all that, and far right politics and all that, but what have been your impressions of how Ukrainian society is coping with this war, or not coping with this war, in your recent visits?
So I must say that I was raised in near Lviv, in
Mm,
very nationalistic surroundings, let's say. And from early years in my life, despite of very multi-ethnic background of my extended family, the prevailing ideology was Ukrainian nationalistic ideology. And partly because I believe, because we lived in small village, My parents built a wonderful house there, and we lived in this, small community. And as we know, in every country, small community means more social control and more social pressure. And this group dynamic basically had a strong influence on your behavior and and in your daily life. So basically, this discipline was imposed on me from my childhood. That's why I was raised on this nationalistic myth about glorious, fighters, members of Ukraine underground movement, Ukraine insurgent army, UPA, and OUN, organization of Ukraine nationalists, and they were celebrated in my school. We learned during my music classes. We learned all these, patriotic songs that were popular and crafted in Ukraine underground movement. So basically, this identity was the main identity that surrounded me from the very beginning. And I must admit that some part of my family was involved in Ukraine nationalist underground movement, and they were repressed. Some of them were put in prison, and some of them and their family members were sent to Siberia to special settlement. And every almost every our family gathering involved histories about Soviet repressions. And actually, the house that my parents built was on the territory, on the land that was seized by Soviets in 1939. And they remembered how they were stripped of everything because of this, decolonization and, this Sovietization and collectivization. So this memory was prevalent in my family, and it was the hegemonic narrative. That's why I was raised in this highly nationalistic environment. When I moved to Lviv, when I became a student at Lviv National University, Ivan Franko, actually I met almost the same atmosphere in Lviv. We know that Lviv is a very nationalistic city with the biggest monument to Stepan Bandera, and my place, my home was close to Bandera Street, Melnik Street, Konovalets Street, Shukhevich Street, and I used to walk my son to the school all on partisan streets. So I wasn't surprised, by all those developments during wartime. But what surprised me really, that after Maidan revolution in post-Maidan Ukraine, this very marginal, let's say, this very Western Ukraine nationalistic myth, historical myth, started to move eastward to Kyiv, then further, and and after 2022, it became really the national myth promoted on the very national level. That's why, for example, under President Zelensky, we nowadays we have streets named Bandera and Shukhevich in Kryvyi Rih, native town of our President Zelensky. We have in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, in Kharkiv Oblast, in Odessa Oblast. It's ridiculous, how this myth is cultivated in Ukraine, in wartime Ukraine, in order, to spark this national, uprising, to mobilize, the people. But last year, but another dimension of this very troubling development is that Nazi apology is flourishing. Why? Because many of OUN and UPA members of Ukraine nationalists on the ground, during the Second World War, they were members of auxiliary police under German occupation, and some of them occupied chief positions. So they were not just ordinary rank and file policemen. They were a chief of police, like Levkovich, for example. It's a very glorious figure in this nationalist pantheon. And those people nowadays are celebrated as freedom fighter, and their direct participation in the Holocaust is obscured, is marginalized and silenced, and even denied. And we have this from, adopting of this memory law in 2015, but now it's flourishing. And, last time I was in Ukraine last summer, I visited my family because my mother was dying due to cancer. And it was very important for me to spend last days with her. So I spent in Ukraine almost a month. And I visited Lviv, I visited my friends, relatives, and I made the several walks at the city center. And I was really shocked. I visited the prostor of synagogue, the space of synagogues where the Holocaust memorial is erected, wonderful Holocaust memorial. But there I saw swastika, SS bolts, solar cross, and right, several meters away, I saw, these fancy souvenir magazines with, socks, Daddy Bandera, and bags, Daddy Bandera. And I was just, I couldn't believe that this is happening, in the country which claims that fighting, against autocracy and for freedom and democracy. And
Mm.
I spent in one day, I walked in the city center. I spent almost 3 hours in the city center, and I must admit that the amount of different hate symbols like SS bolts, like black sun, like Nazi eagle, like swastika, and different combinations of swastika, I never saw in my life, this concentration of these hate symbols. And I
Mm.
used in past 10 years, I used to live in Austria, I used to live in Germany, in US and other countries, and never I saw, I live here in Worcester, in Massachusetts, almost 2 years in a row, and
Mm.
I never saw even once Nazi symbol or other hate symbol.
Mm.
While in Ukraine, it's so normalized. Why? Because it's a part of military culture nowadays. And those
Mm.
symbols are adopted primarily by military actors, by soldiers. And because of the trust to Ukraine military is so high in Ukraine society, approximately more than 90% of Ukrainians nowadays trust Ukraine military. That's why they just accept this. And we know that Ukraine military nowadays is full of different far right groups. They are empowered. They are militarized. They are sponsored, and they are celebrated as freedom fighters. And we know one of the problem is that nowadays in Ukraine military we have overt Nazi apology. What I mean by that, for example, we have Nachtigall unit. This Nachtigall unit is named after Nachtigall Battalion, formed by German Abwehr, and this battalion participated in Barbarossa Plan and in attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, and it was led from Ukraine side by Roman Shukhevich. Former later he became a UPA commander, and this unit,
And he's one of the more sort of notorious
yeah,
leaders
most
of
iconic
the
figure.
Ukrainian nationalist movement. Yeah.
Exactly. And later, from the documents of some participants of this Nachtigall unit, we know that they participated in anti-Jewish pogroms in Vinnytsia Oblast. They reveal this information is from their diaries,
Mm.
and for example, we have this, and commanders of this unit are very open about the very title of their unit. Yes, we celebrate our great grandfathers, and their glorious fight against, Soviets. Then another problem, we have Luftwaffe unit, and commanders of this unit explained, Germans, our most, devoted allies. That's why we borrowed their name. But they don't, but they not only borrow Luftwaffe name, but borrow Nazi eagle, not
Mm.
the current insignia, but Nazi eagle that was appropriated by Luftwaffe in Nazi Germany. Another problem, Russian Volunteer Corps that was organized in spring 2022 is led by Denis Nikitin, White Rex, who is a neo-Nazi, and he was subjected to Schengen-wide ban in 2019 because of his extremist activity. He trained, for example, neo-Nazis in UK, and this organization that he trained, was banned and in Ukraine and listed as terrorist organization. And he's in his social media, he openly celebrates Hitler's birthday. He's open about his white supremacist ideas, and nobody cares. And he's invited by major mainstream Ukraine media,
mm,
mainstream Western media, and celebrated as freedom fighter.
mm,
And nobody put pay attention to his views. And we, so basically, this war, I mean, especially after 2022, empowers so many neo Nazis and far right groups, and they openly promote their agenda. They openly celebrate Nazi units. They openly celebrate Wehrmacht. Why? Because their ideology is those guys are lesser evil because they fought our eternal enemy, meaning Russians.
mm,
So, and they compare themselves with Nazis. So it's not Putin only who compared them with Nazis, but they themselves compare themselves with Nazis, and
mm,
it's ridiculous.
mm.
It's just crazy. Why do you need Nazi insignia to fight Russians?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This raises a really interesting issue, which we might come back to a bit later, which is how some of this extreme ethno-nationalism, I'm going to call it, but uh, might sort of spill over to particularly European societies, especially given Europe has had some issues with managing, integration of migrants and
Yes.
people from different cultural groups in recent years and a lot over history. um, but you raised the sort of statement from Vladimir Putin that part of the objective of the war is denazification of Ukraine, and that's been quite controversial from particularly in Western audiences. There's been a lot of pushback from that. There's been a lot of um, in a non-judgmental way, Ukraine supporters in the West have said, this is just Russian propaganda. You can't say everyone in Ukraine's a Nazi, that sort of thing. How would you describe the nature of the um, far right Nazi ethno-nationalist problem in Ukraine at the moment? I mean, you've already
Okay.
given some insights into it, but specifically, is it something people should be worried about?
Actually, I want to admit that this Putin's argument about denazification of Ukraine as his aim actually played a huge role in all this denial that is happening now in terms of Ukraine far right groups, because
Mm,
people believe if Ukraine is a victim and Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression,
mm,
that you should challenge all talking points of aggressor.
mm,
And partly is true. You should be conscious that we are living in informational war, which is a substantial part of this war of aggression against Ukraine. And Putin, of course, he instrumentalized the memory and the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Of course. Why? It's obvious, for example, this obsession with the Great Patriotic War in Russia, the celebration of Victory Day. And they have this, in Russia, in many cities, they have this immortal regiment when
mm,
people crossing, marching across the streets, and they, carrying the portraits of their great grandfathers who fought Nazis. And what is interesting, from 2022, some people whose relatives died in the front line in Ukraine carried the portraits of their relatives, meaning they made a clear link
mm,
between this, war against Nazis and between Russian war against Ukraine. Why? Because it's in line with this official Russian propaganda about Nazis in Ukraine. And Russian official propaganda, Kremlin propaganda, tries to present this war as a, continuation of this war against, Nazi evil, and against those Nazis who are, in Europe and they want to conquer Russia and all this stuff. So basically, it's a pure, instrumentalization and propaganda. But it doesn't mean that Ukraine don't have so-called Nazi problem. We know that Nazi groups are everywhere, basically, and now they are so empowered and now they are flourishing everywhere. But in Ukraine, there is Ukraine is very specific in this regard. Why? Everyone who is trying to argue that Ukraine has no Nazi problem. For example, make arguments about this, the latest parliamentary elections when, united Nazi nationalistic parties gain only 2% of voters. But the problem of Ukraine democracy, in quoting Marx, is that nationalist groups in Ukraine, they exercise power not through parliamentary, not through seats in the parliament. They exercise their power like nationalists exercise their power in Weimar Republic, in streets. They threaten politicians, they threaten prosecutors with violence against them and their family members. They threaten President Zelensky by developing, this no capitulation campaign against him, while they put pressure on him not to basically implement Minsk agreement that was partially a problem later for Ukraine that led to these complications with Russia. So basically, nationalists in Ukraine they even before 2022 they were empowered, because let's take Azov movement. It wasn't just some marginal political movements, some marginal party. This movement was sponsored by the minister Avakov. That they were sponsored by oligarch Kolomoisky. They got a lot of ammunition, a lot of uniforms, a lot of everything. They organized, Ukraine even before 2022 became a hotbed for neo-Nazis. The famous concerts of so-called nationalist, socialist, national, so Nazi black metal music were transferred from Hungary to Ukraine. And they were networking with different neo-Nazis across Europe, and they developed this idea of intermarium, meaning idea that European countries should unite and resist to both American imperialism and Russian imperialism. So they obsessed with this idea of white Europe, actually white Europe. They always refer to white Europe. That's why they are anti-Muslim, anti-Arab. They are also anti-Semite, because they believe they are proponents of this great replacement theory that the Zionist lobby that controls everything brings Muslim to Europe to weaken Europe and to emasculate Europe and and they pose the threat to white women. They want to impregnate them. They want to weaken white masculinity. So all those conspiracy theories, all these anti-Semitic theories, they are still in place. And after 2022, they even developed. Why? Because we gain present with Jewish origin, and many people refers to Jewish background of Zelensky as an argument why Nazism can be in Ukraine. But for me, it's like an argument that there is no racism, systemic racism, and daily racism in U.S. because U.S. had a black president. It's the same argument, Under Zelensky, the first march commemorating Waffen SS Division Galicia that took place in Kyiv was in 2021. Before that, those marches were primarily in Galicia, in Western Ukraine, where basically Galicia, this division was formed by Nazis, you know. But for
mm,
the first time, under President Zelensky, it took place, you know, in our capital, in
mm,
Kyiv. And I want to pay attention to this Hunka Gate. Maybe our viewers remember that in 2023, a former member of Office and SS Division Galicia, Yaroslav Hunka, was given standing ovation in Canadian Parliament, and our President Zelensky, you know, was very happy to celebrate him. Of course, I believe that Zelensky wasn't aware who actually this guy was, but I am not sure if some, you know, Canadian politicians who are heavily involved in connections with Ukraine diaspora, especially those who have Ukraine background, like
mm,
Christian Freeland, I doubt that they didn't know who this guy is, you
mm,
know? So my suggestion is that it was their attempt to finally legitimize this, you know, heritage and legacy of Waffen
mm,
SS Division Galicia.
mm,
And what was the reaction of President Office? His, you know, team who is responsible for combating disinformation, they started to whitewash the Division Galicia. They started to release statement. Of course, Division Galicia wasn't involved in any crimes, but according to the Shen Commission, some members of Division Galicia members were involved in massacre in Guta Penятska, in
mm,
suppressing bursts of uprising, in anti-partisan actions in Slovakia, for example. What
mm,
does it mean, anti-partisan actions? It means fighting civilians, because
mm,
all partisan groups rely heavily on civilians.
mm,
And we know that, you know, Altiro Dal, while preparing this, you know, report for the Shen Commission in Canada, she indicated that those, you know, hundreds of former Waffen SS Division, Division Galicia members, they were not subjected to precise check, security check during
mm,
this procedure. So Canada just let them go because it was the Cold War. And we
mm,
remember how during Cold War, CIA and other countries, Miss Six, they instrumentalized Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe, from different countries, you know,
mm,
forest brothers from Baltic states. They even attempted to instrumentalize some people in Belarus, you know, without, of course, without major success. But Ukraine Nazi collaborators played a huge role in this,
mm.
you know, in these, you know, games during the Cold War. So nowadays,
Indeed, a Bandera was kind of taken out by the US effectively and
exactly,
supported post-war
exactly,
by the intelligence
exactly.
agencies
And, you know,
effectively. Yeah.
the Voice of America radio, you know,
Mm,
Hollis America, many people who work there, they have had connections with, you know, Bandera movements,
mm,
with, you know, Waffen SS. I remember in 2020, when I visited Ukraine church in Washington, I met some guy who used to work at Hollis Voice of America radio, and he approached me and asked me, what are you doing here? Oh, you're Ukraine, from this big Ukraine, what are you doing here? And I said, you know, I'm a fellow at the USHMM, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, because I'm studying Holocaust in Ukraine. And he said, you know, the, the Holocaust is a fairy tale. Do you know this? This is Zionist fairy tale, because, you know, Nazis couldn't have enough gas even to you know, to suffocate, you know, 6 million Jews. And I was like, you know, I was trying to, you know, to collect myself and, you
yeah.
know, to react in decent way, because I was new there, you know, and I was surrounded by all these, you know, nationalists, you know, people in Vyshyvanka and all this, you know, traditional clothing. And I was really, I felt really threatened, you know. Um,
Mm,
But he was introduced to me as very respected member of Ukraine community, who carry who is defender of Ukraine national interests, and so on and so forth. So I was shocked, how
Mm,
many people still in diaspora, they cherish this nationalistic myth.
mm,
And I remember at the same time I met one woman, and she told me, yeah, I remember during this Demjanjuk trial, remember this Nazi collaborator from
mm,
Nazi concentration camp who was accused of, he mistakenly was accused to be Ivan Grozny. He wasn't Ivan Grozny, but still, I recommend this film, Something Next Door.
uh-huh.
Documentary, remember?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Wonderful documentary about Demjanjuk. But what is really important, that he actually was a guard in Nazi concentration camps. And this lady told me, we used to make dumplings and to sell them after, after service, church service to Ukraine community, to raise money for his lawyer because he
Mm,
was innocent. And I was left speechless.
mm,
I was left speechless.
mm,
I
mm,
understand why Ukrainians were so, were so desperate to prove that he wasn't innocent, because it
mm,
was the entire issue of, they struggle with this, Russian Soviet propaganda about that wanted to discredit the entire Ukraine national cause. But at the same time, they basically put their efforts in advocating real Nazi collaborator. And
mm,
according to many testimonies, he was really involved in real crimes, not just,
mm.
he was basically willing executor of Nazi will.
And some of these, uh, well, this culture of ethno-nationalism, let's call it, is quite deep and long-standing. I mean, Ukraine has both a complex, rich history of cultural diversity, like as I recall it, I think Odessa, for example, used to have like, 30% Jews maybe pre
Exactly.
First World War, and like 100 different languages were spoken, and but also a very pretty dark history of anti-Semitism and ethnically based violence, not just against Jewish people, but against Poles, against Russians, against presumably Crimean Tatars. I don't know the
Yes.
specifics of it as well.
Yes.
And the Hemoniski
Yes.
massacres,
Uprising.
which
Yeah.
happened
Yeah.
in like 1640s, 1650s, which kind of plays a role in the sort of Ukrainian nationalist story of,
Yeah.
war of independence kind of thing. I recently read Simon Sharma's book on the history of the Jews in this period, and I think the statistic was about 90% of Jews who lived in what is now Ukraine, was then part of Poland, Lithuania, were either killed or forced to flee the country in that period as well. So it's got a. So what do you think is sort of driving? Because it's obviously not just a kind of a reaction to the events of last, you know, 3 years or the last 10 years. What do you think it is? Sort of, is it a sort of a victim myth, or what's sort of driving it? Do you think?
You know what is very interesting? Here in Massachusetts, I feel more at home than in Lviv.
Mm,
Why? Because I met here many of my students. Actually, they are descendants of those Jews who fled Ukraine during this wave of anti-Jewish pogroms in Odessa, for example, in at the beginning of 20th century, during civil war, 1917, 1921, and they are descendants of those people, and they preserve the memory of these shtetls, local Jewish towns, and we talk with them about their family stories, about this bigger picture of these events. And when I was living in Ukraine, those kinds of stories, they were so marginalized. They were never, spoke so vividly, so openly, especially in places where these massacres happened. For example, Lviv, my native Lviv. Before the Second World War, every a third person in Lviv was Jew. It was, it was city with such a great Jewish culture, with such a great Jewish history, with those wonderful synagogues. And when Soviets came, they started those repressions, and then this infamous Lviv pogrom of July 1st July of 1941. And recently I came across of one textbook, a school textbook that was published recently last year and was recommended for Ukraine public schools. And guess what? There is no mention of this pogrom. And it was not only Lviv, but major cities, Ternopil, Zolochiv, Drohobych, other major cities in Western Galicia that were anti-Jewish pogroms in summer 1941, where locals played a huge role. Of course, they were instigated, in most cases, they were instigated by Germans, because Germans wanted to use Ukrainian hands to do this, dirty job. They wanted to organize these so-called self-cleansing operations. They speculate on this Judeo-Bolshevism myth, on this, they blame collectively Jews for all Soviet repressions, and so on and so forth. They speculate on this Christian anti-Semitism. And because of so many locals were involved in this collective guilt is still present in Ukraine cities, and this memory is suppressed, silenced, and policing. I conducted dozens of interviews in those shtetls that had a substantial Jewish minority in Western Ukraine. And every single time when I was trying to raise question about Jewish community and what happened to this Jewish community, people started, to lower their voice. They were afraid. Some of them, even showed me some things that they took from Jewish homes, during the Holocaust, yeah, when Jews were placed in the ghetto, or killed by Nazis and local policemen. And it's a very difficult story. And many of those stories, basically, many of my informants, they even asked me not to indicate those stories and not to publish this, because they are afraid. It's a local community where we have a lot of these watchdogs, and their descendants, their children, their grandchildren are still living there, so they don't want to put them at risk. So even today, it's still so difficult to talk about this, but I believe this difficult talk is necessary, because we will never get rid of this anti-Semitism. What I observe in Ukraine, we have anti-Semitism on the rise because of the empowering of these far-right groups, and because of the Jewish background of Ukraine president. Many people in Ukraine started to believe that Zelensky is somehow connected to this, globalist, you know, this network of people who want to take Ukraine land, who want to kill all Ukraine people, and take their possessions, take their minerals, take everything from them. you know every When society is in crisis, deep crisis, when society is poor, when society is threatened, like Ukrainian society, when people don't see hope, They are
mm,
trying to seek scapegoats,
mm, mm,
Jews over centuries were the scapegoats for so many people.
mm,
In Ukraine, ordinary people, even some of my colleagues started to share this nonsense about Jews, about thousands of Jews who are resettled from Israel after 7 October, because according to some unknown treaty between Israel and Ukraine, they want to save Jews. It's ridiculous.
mm,
And
mm,
people who are professors, who are academics, they share this nonsense. But
mm,
why? Because society is in deep crisis, and
mm,
because Nazi apologism is flourishing on the highest level.
mm,
Recently, I
mm,
came across, it was one exhibition prepared by Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the key memory agent in Ukraine Institute of National Memory. So they made this excursus in Ukraine history about military Ukraine history, and guess what? They indicated that the largest ethnic group in Ukraine underground movement after the second largest after Ukrainians were Jews, actually.
mm,
And
mm,
I was so surprised. It's a fairy tale. It's a rewriting
mm,
history,
mm,
and
mm,
nothing about hunting Jews in the street, in the forest,
mm, mm,
nothing about kidnapping Jewish doctors from ghettos. I
mm,
remember my one of my interview with member of Ukraine Nationalists Underground, and I asked her about Jewish doctors because we know that Nationalists Underground, it was a great lack of doctors, so they kidnapped them from ghettos and they forced them to serve their interests. So I asked her about this Jewish doctor, and her response was, "Yes, we had such a great Jewish doctor." And he was always with guards. And I was so surprised. I saw that he was so respected, that he was, with guards. And I asked her, so what was the purpose? What was the task of these guards? And she told me, why? Why you ask? It's obvious. Because they're afraid that he will escape. Really? So nowadays they are trying to create these fairy tales, and they want to
mm,
present those, dozens, couple dozens of Jews, who joined ranks of Ukrainian nationalists underground for different reasons.
mm,
First of all, for means of survival, they want to present them, as the second largest ethnic group.
mm,
Okay, but if you are talking about this story, so if you say A, let's say B. And what happened to those doctors in the spring 1944? Many of them were killed. Why? Because the Red Army was approaching, and they believed that those Jews will betray them, and they will switch the sides.
mm,
So let's be open about what happened to those Jews, in
mm,
spring 1944.
mm,
And everything is so silenced, everything is so policing. And, the problem is that people, historians like me, who trying to challenge this, hegemonic narrative, this fairy tale, are persecuted, are bullied, are silenced, and are basically labeled as traitors because they
mm,
say, you are facilitating Russian propaganda. So maybe you are a traitor. Maybe you are, maybe Russians pay you. Maybe you are. I was labeled, as an agent of Mossad, agent of, Kremlin, and agent of Warsaw, and every single possible enemy of Ukrainian people. But
mm,
it's ridiculous. What we observe is the fascization of Ukraine education system in Ukraine and Ukraine military. But most worrying is education. In Babin Holocaust Memorial Center, for the first time in 2021, with the cooperation of the Office of the President, for the first time in all the public schools, the center established and performed this, lesson of memory commemorating specifically Babin Yar.
mm,
Baban Yar tragedy that happened in September, the late September 1941, where almost 34,000 Jews, mostly children, women, and elderly people, were killed by Nazis. In Kiev, Baban Yar became a symbol of, a Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe. And but after that, when the Russian aggression started, it was the end of this. It was the end, basically, of this initiative. And what we
mm,
have now, we have our president who still commemorate victims of Baban Yar in the late September 1941. But at the same time, we have Nachtigall unit, we have Luftwaffe unit with Nazi Eagle. We have Vedmedi unit, which uses SS bolts and SS motto, "My honor is loyalty," as the official symbols.
mm,
And we
mm,
have a lot of, units like Karpatska, Sich, like Svoboda, like Vovki da Vinci, like Azov unit, Kraken, the Third Assault Brigade, which uses Nazi symbols, like, Derlivanger patch, this infamous Derlivanger SS division, very infamous, notorious for its brutal crimes against civilian population. Yeah, they use, for example, Volksangel, still, they use Totenkopf. It's ridiculous.
mm, mm,
Under Zelensky supervision, he is the
mm,
chief commander of the army that uses Nazi symbols. It's ridiculous. And I am calling all the time on Ukrainian commanders. Why are you doing this? How it helps Ukraine national cause?